The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Jackson, Mississippi. Elena Martinez, an FBI agent, drove home after a long day of working through complex cases. The cool evening air flowed through the open window of her car, offering a brief moment of respite. The city was familiar, yet it felt foreign when her mind wandered, wondering how long the fight for justice would really last. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let the surge of adrenaline take hold. Routine traffic stop, or so she hoped. She eased her car to the side of the road and kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel, just as she had been trained to do. Through the side mirror, she saw the officer approach. Bradley Hayes, the officer who'd pulled her over, was tall with a posture that screamed authority. He approached her vehicle with deliberate steps, a sense of entitlement in every move he made. Elena had seen it before. Officers like him often assumed their power could go unchecked. He stopped at the window, his eyes scanning her car. His judgment was immediate, his mind likely made up before he even spoke a word. His gaze lingered just a second too long on her face, the car, as if trying to piece together what kind of person she was. To him, Elena was just another woman driving alone at night in a car that didn't match his idea of who she should be. "License and registration," Officer Hayes barked, his tone sharp. Elena kept her voice calm, though she could feel the tension in the air thickening. It was a familiar scenario, yet the stakes felt different this time. She wasn't just a woman pulled over on a quiet road. She was a woman on a mission, and Hayes didn't know it yet, but he would soon understand the power struggle that would unfold. Elena Martinez was raised in the heart of Jackson, Mississippi, by her mother, Sophia Martinez, a dedicated school teacher, and her father, Carlos Martinez, a retired Marine. Their home was a place of warmth and discipline, but also one of quiet resilience. Her mother had always said that honor is not what you do when the world is watching. It's how you act when no one is around. Her father, on the other hand, believed in the power of integrity. His military background emphasized personal responsibility and the unwavering pursuit of justice, even when it wasn't easy. From an early age, Elena was taught the importance of standing up for what was right. Her parents instilled in her the belief that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the odds. They were the type of people who didn't back down from standing up to injustice, and they passed that spirit on to their daughter. Elena was shaped by their values, driven by the knowledge that the world could be a better place, but only if someone was willing to fight for it. Growing up, Elena often witnessed the disparities in her community, how people of color, especially black women like her mother, were held to different standards by the system. These experiences drove her to pursue a career where she could make a difference. After excelling in her studies, she earned a full scholarship to Jackson State University, where she majored in criminal justice. There, Elena found her calling in law enforcement, determined to expose the corruption within the system she had learned about so intimately. But being a woman of color in a field dominated by men came with its own set of challenges. She faced not just prejudice from outside, but from within her own ranks as well. It was hard to gain respect when people assumed that her abilities were based on her ethnicity rather than merit. Despite the obstacles, Elena's resolve never wavered. She graduated at the top of her class and joined the FBI with a singular goal: to expose and dismantle the corrupt systems of power within law enforcement. She was driven by the belief that justice needed to serve all people, not just those who wore the badge or had influence. And then there was Officer Bradley Hayes, an officer who epitomized the worst of the system. Known for his racist tendencies and excessive use of force, Hayes had a history of racial profiling and corruption. His reputation was built on intimidation, using his authority to manipulate situations and control those he deemed beneath him. Hayes was the type of officer who saw the law as a tool to enforce his own biased views, using his badge as a shield to avoid accountability. He didn't see himself as part of a justice system. He saw himself as the system. It was men like Hayes that Elena had fought against her whole life. And now fate had brought them face to face, setting the stage for a battle that neither of them could have predicted. For him, power was everything. As Elena Martinez sat in her car, the flashing blue and red lights reflected in her rearview mirror, casting a pulsing glow across the interior. The peaceful evening had shattered in an instant. Her breath stayed steady, almost rhythmic, as she waited for the officer to approach. Bradley Hayes moved closer, each step heavy, with a practiced air of authority that made it clear he thought he was in control of this situation. Elena didn't flinch. She knew this routine well, too well. Being a black woman in a luxury vehicle, she had faced this kind of bias countless times. It wasn't the first time an officer had looked at her with suspicion simply because of the car she drove. But tonight it would be different. She would not let him intimidate her. Hayes stopped at her window, his eyes sweeping across her, sizing her up, clearly trying to decide if she was worth his time. His tone, when he spoke, was harsh, an immediate attempt to establish dominance. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration," he ordered, his voice clipped and condescending. Elena's response was calm, almost measured. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer didn't miss a beat, offering only a dismissive glance. "You were speeding," he muttered, though Elena knew she hadn't been. The highway was empty, and her speed had been steady and within limits. She had been driving cautiously, as she always did when stopped by officers. It wasn't her first time, but this time, something felt different. His attitude told her he wasn't simply doing his job. He was out to make her uncomfortable. She handed him her documents without hesitation, maintaining a calm posture. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She had dealt with these moments before, but this time she had a different tool in her hands: the truth. Hayes didn't even look at the documents at first. His eyes lingered on her face, his expression hardening as he made a judgment about her based solely on what he saw: a woman in a high-end car. He looked at her as though she didn't belong. His assumptions were all too familiar, but Elena wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of being right. "Seems like a woman like you doesn't drive a car like this," Hayes sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You got this car from someone else, didn't you? What'd you do to afford it? Tell me, how's a lady like you living so high?" Elena held his gaze unfazed. She knew exactly what he was implying, but she wasn't going to play into his game. His assumptions about her based on race and gender were obvious, and they were designed to undermine her from the very start. "I don't understand what you're getting at, officer," she replied evenly, "but I assure you I've earned everything I have." Her words barely seemed to register. He was already moving on to the next judgment, still glaring at her as if trying to find something to pick apart. His prejudice was blinding him to the truth, to the simple fact that Elena Martinez wasn't someone he could easily dismiss. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of responding with anger. Instead, she responded with quiet authority. "Step out of the vehicle," Hayes demanded, his voice a little more forceful now. "You're under arrest for obstruction." Elena's heart didn't race. Her posture didn't change. Her resolve solidified. It was exactly what he was waiting for, to provoke her into a response, to turn the tables on her. But she wasn't going to give him that power. His decision to escalate the situation wasn't her fault, it was his. She had seen officers like him before, those who wore their badge as an excuse to impose their biases, and she knew exactly how this would play out. She stayed seated, taking a slow, measured breath. "Officer Hayes, I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said quietly. Her fingers moved with purpose, pulling out a small leather case from her jacket pocket. She didn't give him the satisfaction of watching him squirm. She simply opened it, revealing her FBI badge. Hayes froze. His eyes flickered between her face and the badge in her hand. The smug look on his face faltered for just a moment, and for the first time that evening, his posture softened, but only slightly. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "I'm Special Agent Elena Martinez with the FBI," Elena continued, her voice calm but firm. She made no effort to hide the weight of her position. She wasn't some driver to be targeted for fun. She was his superior, and this moment, this power struggle, was over before it had even started. Hayes stepped back, his face shifting from arrogance to uncertainty. The roles had reversed, and it was Elena who was now in control of the situation. The air between them crackled with the shift in power. Elena had already seen this story play out before. She had spent years working with the system to fight it, and now she was taking back what he thought he could take from her. "I suggest you get back in your car, officer," she said coolly, watching as Hayes' confidence crumbled in front of her. The flashing lights, once threatening, now seemed distant. She wasn't just another driver anymore. She was a force in the system, and she would make sure it worked for justice. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the car's engine and the distant sounds of night. Hayes stood frozen in front of Elena's car, his hand still lingering near his gun holster, the silence hanging between them like a cloud. The blue and red lights continued to pulse, casting a surreal glow over the scene. Elena's calmness, however, was like a steady beacon in the storm that was brewing. Hayes didn't move immediately. He stood there, processing the weight of what had just been revealed to him. The reality was setting in, and in those few seconds, he was finally beginning to understand what he had gotten himself into. But then the anger crept in. The flash of realization that Elena wasn't just some random woman on the road, but a federal agent, was disorienting. But what Hayes did next showed just how deeply his arrogance ran. It was almost as if he couldn't accept that his perception of the situation had been wrong. He had always been the one with the power. No woman, no person of color should ever dare challenge that. With a sharp exhale, Hayes stepped back toward Elena's car. His eyes were narrowed and his jaw was set. The sudden shift in his demeanor was unmistakable. This was no longer just a traffic stop for him. He was determined to regain control, to reassert himself in a situation that had spun out of his reach. "I'm giving you one more chance," Hayes said, his voice laced with venom. His hand hovered over his sidearm, a clear threat. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll force you to." Elena didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the steering wheel, her eyes still locked on his. She had seen this before. The inflated ego, the power struggle, the need for control. But tonight, this wasn't his game to win. "I don't think you want to escalate this, officer," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "You already know I'm an FBI agent. You already know I'm not someone you can intimidate." The words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Hayes was beyond reason now, driven by something deeper than logic, pride, anger, and a desperate need to assert himself. Without warning, he opened the car door forcefully and reached inside. "Get out of the car." His voice was rising now, frantic, his patience running thin. Elena moved quickly, but not out of fear. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket once more, this time pulling out her phone. She didn't speak immediately, but the officers who were listening to the conversation on her comms were already ready to intervene. She raised the phone to her mouth, her eyes still fixed on Hayes, who was now almost shaking with frustration. "You know what I'm going to do, right?" Hayes sneered, stepping closer. "You're going to regret this." But Elena wasn't moving. Her voice cut through the tension. "I'm calling for backup, Officer Hayes." Her words were steady and deliberate. "You're under investigation for misconduct, and I'm documenting this." The sudden realization seemed to hit him like a ton of bricks. The officer whose pride and power had kept him afloat for years now stood before someone who not only outranked him, but had the law on her side. Elena didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise her voice to prove she was in control. She had the authority, and now he knew it. Hayes's eyes flickered, a mix of disbelief and something else, fear. You don't have the right," Hayes began, but his words were losing their edge. The self-assuredness had vanished, replaced by a stammering uncertainty. "Yes, I do," Elena interjected smoothly, "and I suggest you reconsider your next move." The officer took a step back, visibly shaken. The power he had relied on for so long was slipping away from him, unraveling with each word Elena spoke. Her calmness was like an anchor in the chaos that had consumed him. Elena's phone clicked as she hit send. "Backup is on its way, Officer Hayes. You're not getting away with this. Not tonight." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Hayes just stood there, his jaw clenched, the fight draining from him. Elena, however, wasn't waiting. The game had changed. His world had shifted in an instant from being the one with the power to the one who had lost control. And Elena had no intention of letting him take that power back. "You've made your mistake," Elena said, her voice as sharp as steel. "Now you're going to answer for it." At that moment, the flashing lights seemed to magnify and the tension in the air shifted. Hayes knew this wasn't going to go the way he had planned. He had underestimated her. And now the full weight of his arrogance, his bias, and his failure to understand who he was dealing with had caught up with him. The sounds of approaching sirens pierced the night air. Elena had called for backup, and now Hayes was the one who was about to be taken in. The officer, who had once seen himself as above the law, was now facing the consequences of his actions, and Elena Martinez was the one holding the reins. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and reports. Elena Martinez had expected some pushback, but she hadn't anticipated the speed with which things would unravel. The internal investigation into Officer Bradley Hayes was launched almost immediately. The video footage from her dashboard camera, along with the audio recordings from her phone, provided undeniable proof of the unwarranted aggression and misconduct Hayes had displayed. The first few days after the incident felt surreal. Elena had never doubted her decision to call for backup and expose Hayes's actions. But now, facing the bureaucratic aftermath, she found herself questioning what it would mean for her career. She had fought for justice, but in doing so, she had also exposed the deep flaws within the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. The system that was supposed to protect and serve had often been a vehicle for oppression and abuse, and she had become part of the conversation about how to fix it. But now, she was wondering if her actions would cost her everything she had worked for. The media caught wind of the incident, and Elena found herself under the spotlight. Her name was now synonymous with accountability, a beacon of hope for some and a target for others. Some hailed her as a hero, others called her a troublemaker who had taken down one of their own. But Elena didn't let the noise distract her. The fight for justice had never been about the recognition. As Elena sat in her office late one evening, going through the reports from the internal investigation, she found herself staring at a file marked Officer Hayes, Case Overview. She couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had done the right thing. She had taken down a man who had perpetuated abuse under the guise of the law. She had exposed the corruption that ran through the system. But there was more to it. There were always more layers to peel back. This wasn't just about Hayes. This was about a culture that needed to change. And as much as Elena had hoped that one arrest would change everything, she knew it wouldn't. The rot ran deep, and it would take more than just one act of bravery to root it out. Officer Hayes, meanwhile, was a different story. In the weeks following the incident, he dug in his heels. He refused to back down, to admit he had done anything wrong. His lawyer began to spin a narrative that painted him as the victim of an elaborate setup. He claimed racial bias on Elena's part, accusing her of using her FBI position to humiliate him. He claimed that his arrest of Elena was simply an act of self-defense against her perceived resistance. The internal investigation continued, but Hayes's influence was powerful. His lawyer filed countless motions, trying to delay the inevitable, and rumors of his connections within the department and local government began to surface. Pressure mounted on Elena, with colleagues questioning whether she had acted too hastily. There were whispers of potential retaliation against her, and some even wondered aloud if she had become too much of a problem in a system that didn't want to face the truth. Despite the mounting pressure, Elena remained resolute. She knew the risks of challenging one of her own, but she had never been one to back down from a fight. If she wanted the system to change, she had to be the one to challenge it. She couldn't let the fear of retaliation keep her from doing what was right. The phone rang, cutting through her thoughts. She answered it, her fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the desk. "Elena," said Daniel Rivera, her colleague and friend, "I wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Elena said, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "The investigation is moving forward, but it's not just about Hayes anymore. It's about the whole system." "I know," Daniel replied, "but I need you to know this. What you're doing is bigger than any of us. You're not alone in this fight, and we'll make sure Hayes doesn't walk away from this." Elena took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief that only a few trusted allies had managed to provide. "Thanks, Daniel. I won't stop. I can't stop. This is bigger than just me." As she hung up the phone, Elena looked out the window, watching as the city of Jackson continued to pulse with life outside her office. The weight of what she had started was becoming heavier with every passing day. She had opened a door, and she couldn't close it now. The consequences were still unclear, but one thing was certain. Elena Martinez was not backing down. She had faced the darkness within the system, and now she would keep pushing forward, knowing that her fight for justice wasn't just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Months passed before the internal investigation into Officer Bradley Hayes reached its conclusion. The evidence, both the video footage and Elena's first-hand testimony, was undeniable. Hayes was convicted of abuse of power, racial profiling, and misconduct. The verdict sent shockwaves through the department, a reminder that no officer, no matter how powerful, was beyond accountability. The sentence, though not as severe as Elena had hoped, was still a step in the right direction, a public admission of guilt and a message that the system was finally starting to hold itself accountable. Elena watched from the sidelines as Hayes was led away, his once confident demeanor shattered. She wasn't celebrating his downfall. There was no joy in seeing someone's career end in disgrace. But there was a sense of closure, a sense that, at least for now, justice had prevailed. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a significant victory in the ongoing war against corruption and abuse. As she walked back to her office after the trial, Elena's thoughts turned inward. The road to this point had been far from easy. The pressure, the scrutiny, the fear of retaliation, all of it had weighed heavily on her. But Elena had come to realize that this was the cost of justice. To change a system that was built to protect the powerful, one had to be willing to risk everything. And though it had cost her peace of mind, it had never been about her. It had always been about the people she vowed to protect. Justice had been served, but Elena knew the fight wasn't over. There were still many like Hayes out there, hiding behind badges and abusing their authority. Her victory had shown that change was possible, but it would take more than just one case to bring real reform to the system. As Elena looked out over the city, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would never stop fighting.